You can open your phone right now and see things that would have, honestly, given a Victorian a literal heart attack.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? And you walk down the street and sexuality is just quite literally everywhere. It's commodified, it's highly aestheticized, plastered on billboards, woven into fashion campaigns, streaming directly into our living rooms on a daily basis.
Yes, hyper visible.
Exactly. And on the surface, I think to a lot of people, it looks like this complete triumph of human liberation. We won, right? But, and this is why we're doing this deep dive today, there is a massive striking paradox here.
Right.
What if, despite all of this absolute hypervisibility, your desires are actually more tightly policed today than they were 100 years ago?
I think they are.
Yeah. So today we are exploring the hidden architecture of modern morality, shame, and freedom to ask what is honestly a rather haunting question. Is our supposed liberation just a, much more sophisticated, invisible form of control?
And, well, to answer that, we really have to stop looking for external dictators or government mandates. I mean, if we want to understand how control operates in a supposedly free society, we need to adopt a deeply analytical Freudian lens.
Right, because it's not always obvious.
Exactly. We have to examine the mechanisms of repression not as, like, laws imposed upon us from above by some cartoon villain, but as invisible structures woven into our culture. And, more crucially, woven directly into our own minds.
Yeah, because when we talk about desires being policed today, we aren't talking about chains or crude prohibitions.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about a system that doesn't scream no, but instead quietly whispers, not like that.
Not like that, yes. That is the perfect way to phrase it.
Right, like consider a few specific realities from the modern landscape right now.
Yeah.
Back in 2025, there was a school teacher in Berlin who was suspended simply for showing a documentary about queer adolescence.
Right, in Berlin of all places.
Exactly. And on a daily basis, we see social media influencers having their accounts restricted, not for posting anything explicitly pornographic, but for sharing, like, a photo of public breastfeeding.
Which is just biologically normal.
Totally. And then you see this baked into the digital architecture that mediates our entire social reality. Like major algorithms routinely suppressing content that discusses menstruation or menopause or, non-heteronormative desire.
Yeah, and the content gets flagged under these incredibly vague, sanitized policy terms, right? Like sensitive content or violating community guidelines.
Yes, community guidelines, the ultimate invisible wall. And the underlying message becomes incredibly clear to you as a user. You are entirely allowed to display your body and your sexuality, but only if it fits into a very specific, consumer-friendly, palatable aesthetic.
Precisely.
If you deviate from that highly polished script, no one drags you off to jail. You just vanish. You're just pushed into digital silence.
Shadow banned out of existence. Which honestly perfectly illustrates how the Freudian concept of repression actually operates.
Okay, unpack that a bit for us.
Well, we suffer from this historical misconception that censorship requires a stern authority figure standing at a podium telling us what we cannot do.
Right, like a literal censor with a red pen.
Exactly. But Freudian repression begins inside the psyche. In order for a human child to survive and become a functioning social being, they must internalize the rules, the anxieties, and the prohibitions of their culture.
So we do it to ourselves.
Yes. This creates the superego. And the superego is this merciless inner judge forged in early childhood from parental authority and societal expectations. The most powerful thing about the superego is that it doesn't just block an action, it censors the impulse itself.
Wait, really? It censors the impulse?
Yeah, it tells you what you should not even want in the first place.
That's, wow. Okay, because we generally think of censorship as a locked door, right? Like a barrier built to keep us out of a specific room. But the way you're describing the superego, it sounds more like a psychological virus we willingly download.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, like it runs constantly in the background of our operating system, rewriting our code so that we police our own thoughts, preemptively altering our desires long before any formal law is ever broken.
And it masks itself entirely as your own conscience. You believe you're making a free choice or that you naturally find a certain thought or behavior distasteful, but that is merely the superego operating flawlessly.
Wow.
The individual basically becomes their own warden. We instinctively trade our raw, chaotic desires for the illusion of safety, for a sense of belonging and moral coherence within the group.
Okay, I understand the mechanism there, but I want to push on the motivation a bit.
Sure, go ahead.
Why does civilization fundamentally fear and suppress unbridled desire in the first place? Like, why does society actually need us to act as our own wardens? What's the threat?
Well, we can trace this back to the two fundamental warring forces within the human psyche, according to Freud. On one side, there's thanatos, which is the death drive.
Right, thanatos.
Yeah. This represents our impulse toward aggression, destruction, repetition, and ultimately a return to inorganic stillness, just wanting it all to stop.
Okay.
And on the opposing side is eros, the life drive. That's our urge toward connection, creation, passionate fusion, and pleasure that serves, absolutely no utilitarian purpose.
Destruction versus connection.
Mm-hmm.
But logically, you would think society would be terrified of the destruction part.
Right.
I mean, the aggression seems like the obvious threat to civilization.
You would think so, yeah. But civilization has actually figured out how to brilliantly instrumentalize thanatos.
Wait, really? How?
Well, aggression is incredibly useful if you want to build an empire. We channel our death drive into massive institutions. We build sprawling militaries. We design highly competitive capitalist markets. We structure adversarial courtroom systems. And, we consume aggressive contact sports.
Ah, I see.
These are all socially sanctioned, highly structured outlets for the human impulse to dominate and conquer. Society literally feeds on thanatos.
Wow, okay. But eros, the connection, the pleasure part, that resists that kind of utility.
Completely. Sexuality and raw desire fundamentally resist domestication. You cannot easily transform genuine chaotic desire into a marketable product, a civic duty, or a national value without distorting it beyond recognition.
Because it's inherently selfish. Or just uncontrollable.
Because true sexual freedom implies a sovereign subject, a person who answers to absolutely no one, not to the state, not to religion, not even to the rational demands of their own ego.
Okay, so if we look at this through an analogy, society basically treats aggression thanatos like a guard dog. You put it on a leash, you train it, and you use it to protect the property.
Yes.
But eros is like a wild wolf. It refuses the leash entirely.
Exactly. And because the wolf refuses the leash, it threatens the very foundation of the social order.
How so?
Well, civilization relies entirely on predictable, disciplined citizens. It needs people who will suppress their immediate impulses to go to work, pay their taxes, follow the rules of the social contract.
Right, we need the trains to run on time.
Exactly. And Eros reviews that the human self is not a stable, rational entity. It is a site of wild contradictions, fluidity, and unconscious forces. If the individual self becomes unstable and sovereign, the predictable social order begins to crumble.
So there has to be a trade-off.
Civilization demands a sacrifice. We have to sacrifice that wildness in exchange for the safety and the warmth of the pack.
But, I mean, you can't just bury something wild and expect it to stay quiet forever. If you bury a wolf, it's going to scratch at the dirt.
Yeah.
The foundational rule of this kind of psychoanalysis is that whatever we repress doesn't just evaporate, right?
All right.
It mutates, and it eventually comes back.
The repressed always returns. That is the golden rule. On the level of the individual, it returns as clinical symptoms like neuroses, outbursts of irrational anger, obsessive-compulsive behaviors, or profound self-sabotage.
And collectively.
On a collective societal level, the repressed returns as moral panics, puritanical crusades, and witch hunts.
Let's talk about the witch hunts, actually, because this fear of unchecked autonomy didn't just start in the modern era. If you look back to the early modern witch hunts in Europe, like across the 15th to the 18th centuries, on paper, that was supposedly a religious and legal campaign against heresy and devil worship.
Right, that was the official narrative. But if you examine the psychological mechanics of those hunts, they reveal a profound terror of unregulated female autonomy and desire.
Because of who they were targeting.
Exactly. The women who were targeted were very frequently those who lived outside the traditional patriarchal structure. They were widows who lived alone, midwives who possessed specialized earthly knowledge of bodies and herbs, or women who simply spoke too freely and defied the marital norms of their village.
Yeah, the concept of unchecked female sexuality fundamentally threatened the divine and social hierarchy.
Completely. The witch was not merely a criminal, she was a projection of the collective repressed. She became the physical embodiment of everything that culture felt it had to violently expel in order to maintain its own fragile illusion of purity and control.
That makes total sense. And we see that same mechanism of repression shift and take a different shape later on. Like, by the time we reach the Victorian era in the 19th century, the witch hunts are over, obviously, but the policing of desire becomes incredibly intimate.
Extremely intimate, yeah.
The Victorian society is famous for corsets, extreme modesty, fiercely rigid gender roles. It was a culture defined by ultimate restraint.
Yes, but beneath that surface of immaculate restraint was a boiling, volatile underworld.
Right.
The Victorian era saw rampant clandestine pornography, massive prostitution networks, and a sprawling epidemic of what the medical establishment diagnosed at the time as hysteria.
Which was basically a catch-all diagnosis, right?
Oh, entirely. The early psychoanalytic patients were predominantly women suffering under the unbearable pressure of embodying an absolute ideal of domestic purity, while simultaneously having to deny the very life force that animated them.
So what happened to them?
When the conscious mind could no longer speak the truth of their desires, their bodies spoke it for them. They suffered from mysterious paralysis, mutism, severe convulsions. The clinical symptom was simply the truth appearing in disguise.
The symptom is the truth in disguise. I love that framing. But, we tend to view ourselves as entirely separate from those historical periods.
Yes, we do.
We jump forward into the 20th century with the rise of mass consumer culture and modern advertising, and we think, oh, we have completely evolved past the witch hunts and the Victorian corsets. We're liberated.
We tell ourselves that, yes.
But advertising effectively hacked the human psyche. It figured out how to stimulate the repressed desire without ever actually satisfying it.
Exactly. It formed the perfect alliance between capitalism and the superego.
How does that work?
Well, the core logic of the market relies on manufacturing a sense of lack. You create a deep longing, you offer a partial, temporary relief through a physical product, and you ensure the cycle repeats indefinitely.
Right, you buy the perfume, but you don't actually get the romance.
Exactly. Sexuality was transformed into a tool of seduction rather than a means of liberation. The body is placed on display everywhere, but it functions only as a promise of fulfillment, a promise that is structurally designed to never actually arrive.
Because if you're fulfilled, you stop buying things.
Precisely. This is not the elevation of human desire into art or authentic connection. It is the degradation of desire into an engine for endless consumption.
So we consider ourselves post-Victorian, but we simply traded the corset for the shopping cart.
That's exactly it.
We haven't transcended our desire at all. We have just hollowed it out. We turned an internal, messy human experience into a superficial billboard.
The erotic has been completely hollowed out, which really brings us directly to the present day, where the mechanisms of control have become vastly more insidious, precisely because they disguise themselves as progress and liberation.
Okay, so I have to challenge this framing here, because there's a very obvious counter-argument that I think a lot of people listening would make.
Let's hear it.
We live in an era that loudly celebrates sexual diversity. We have open, widespread discussions about gender identity. We have a massive cultural focus on inclusivity and breaking down taboos. By every metric of visibility, we are exponentially freer now than the Victorians were. How can you argue that we are more tightly policed?
Because visibility is not the same thing as freedom.
Okay, expand on that.
The paradox of modern tolerance is that our current acceptance is highly conditional. Society dictates that you can be gay, provided you are monogamous, respectable, and entirely non-threatening to the suburban status quo.
Right.
You are permitted to explore kink as long as it is quietly negotiated, heavily processed, and kept neatly in its designated box. You can identify outside the traditional gender binary, provided you do so in a way that is legally legible, easily categorized, and palatable to the corporate workplace.
Wow, so true. Messy difference, the kind of difference that actually unsettles our core identity and disrupts the social order that is still deeply feared and relentlessly pathologized.
Yes. The underlying structure of repression hasn't disappeared. It has simply updated its vocabulary to survive. Modern morality discarded the old, heavy religious word sin and replaced it with secular, clinical words like inappropriate, problematic, unhealthy, or toxic.
That is fascinating. So the words change, but the function remains.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
These new words operate with chilling efficiency because they wear the benevolent robes of care, of psychological science, and of inclusivity. But they function as the exact same mechanisms of boundary making.
They just sound nicer.
Right. They still rigidly define what is normal against what is deviant. And if you question this new vocabulary, you risk being immediately labeled as a danger to the community.
I struggle with how far we take this critique, particularly when it comes to the modern framework of consent, because, consent isn't Puritanism. It is the absolute baseline for treating another human being with dignity.
Absolutely.
We need a strict framework to ensure people aren't violated or coerced. How is the effort to make human interaction safe and communicative a form of repression?
Well, let's be clear. The protection against violation is foundational, and the legal concept of consent is vital for a functioning society. No one is arguing against that.
Right.
The Freudian critique arises when we attempt to transpose that conscious, legalistic framework onto the deeply unconscious, fundamentally irrational nature of desire itself.
Oh, I see.
The paradox is that in our necessary efforts to create safety, we have begun to demand that desire behave like a rational corporate contract. We demand that it be entirely conscious, fully verbalized, and devoid of ambiguity.
But desire isn't rational.
Exactly. Desire is driven by unconscious fantasies, by early childhood wounds, by power dynamics, and by impulses we barely understand ourselves. It completely defies courtroom logic.
Right, so by trying to make desire completely safe and empowering, we are basically demanding the ocean only produce predictable waves.
Yes.
We want the aesthetic of the water, but we refuse to tolerate the undertow. We end up building a highly chlorinated swimming pool and trying to convince ourselves it's the sea.
That is a beautiful way to put it. We demand that Eros justify its own existence through utility. We demand that it prove itself to be healthy or communicative or empowering. But Eros requires no justification. It simply is.
Right.
When we insist on constantly therapizing our desires or regulating them into a sanitized wellness exercise, we strip the erotic of its inherent ambiguity and its necessary risk. We foreclose the only space where a truly unknown, unguarded encounter with another human being might actually occur.
Because we are terrified of drowning in that undertow, so we legislate the ocean out of existence.
Precisely.
So as we're wrapping this up, we're really looking at a haunting trade-off here. It's the conflict between the desire to belong and the desire for true freedom. And this isn't just an abstract philosophical problem. It dictates how we operate at our jobs, how we text our friends, how we present ourselves online every single day.
It does, and the ultimate tragedy of civilization is that we genuinely require this suppression to function. We do.
Right, we need the rules.
We need the superego so that we can look at a stranger on the street and trust them. We need shared rules to maintain a predictable shared world. But an overabundance of suppression breeds profound societal misery.
And we are definitely seeing that.
We see the symptoms of this collective neurosis everywhere today. Look at the rise of incel ideology, the constant daily moral panics on social media, the obsession with policing other people's behavior, and this quiet, pervasive epidemic of sexual anhedonia, where people are technically free to do whatever they want but find they feel absolutely nothing at all.
Because the life drive has been completely sanitized out of it.
Yes. These are the symptoms of a collective psyche speaking in code about its unresolved conflict. It's torn between the desperate need to belong to the social order and the primal need to actually feel alive.
We constantly mistake safety for freedom. I mean, we spend an immense amount of daily energy curating our inner lives to ensure they are perfectly smooth, coherent, socially acceptable.
Curating is the perfect word.
Yeah, we preempt shame by never letting a transgressive thought fully form. We weaponize concepts like boundaries and self-awareness to build these elaborate fortresses around ourselves.
We do.
But in doing all of that, we are secretly mourning the wild, irrational dimension of our own desire. We are actively participating in the sacrifice of our own aliveness just so we can secure our place in the pack.
And that is the quiet horror of modern subjectivity. We are no longer forced into repression by external tyrants. We willingly embrace it. We refine it. We polish our own cages.
Wow.
We do this because we deeply fear what we might become if we didn't have the rigid scaffolding of these modern norms. If we truly surrendered to Eros, the ego would dissolve. The carefully constructed boundaries of our identity would blur.
And we'd lose the plot of our own curated lives.
Exactly. We would no longer be the sovereign authors of our own narratives. We would be swept into a current that is infinitely older than human reason. And to a modern culture that is entirely obsessed with autonomy, agency, and self-mastery, that total loss of control is simply intolerable.
It's terrifying to people. And it brings us right back to the central paradox we started with. The hypervisible billboards, the endless scrolling on dating apps, the loud performative displays of liberation. It functions as a massive distraction.
Yes.
It's a spectacle designed to hide the tightest, most efficient control mechanism of all, which is ourselves.
Which leaves us with a deeply personal inquiry. The greatest threat to your freedom is not oppression, but protection.
So, as you go about your day, consider the intense discomfort of wanting something you cannot rationally defend, something that absolutely does not fit the neat, sanitized, progressive story you tell about yourself. Ask yourself not what society represses out there in the political world, but what have you buried in order to be loved?
And perhaps the most terrifying question of all, What if you have been policing yourself for so long you have forgotten it is even there?